Thank you. Thank you for being here. It's a very nice audience, and coming to the Historical Society always feels like coming home for me. So it's wonderful to be back. If I'd known that I was the first installment in this series, I would have run like heck as soon as I hit that pass. But anyway, it's good to be here, and I'm very happy. I'm very pleased to be a part of this series, and it sounds like it's going to be a terrific series. I also want to thank Katie White. I don't know, I can't see out there anymore, but there's Katie and Kirby Lambert, of course, for the wonderful invitation to join you and to share a story about a person that I think. There are probably people in the audience who knew this person a lot better than I did. Daphne Bugbee Jones was a towering figure, and I had the pleasure of meeting her about 10 years ago and spending quite a bit of time in the 3 or 4 years before she passed away, and doing an oral history and talking with her about her life and her activities. But she was very well known in Helena, almost as well known in Helena as she was in Missoula, her hometown. She cut a big wake in this town as well as in this state, I should say. And she certainly left her mark. And the part of the story that intrigued me when I met Daphne was, of course, her interest in architecture, her training in architecture, and her contributions to that field. And so when she died in 2013, I was actually quite disappointed in much of what I read about Daphne in the obituaries and in the publications. Certainly her life as a World War II veteran and her involvement in the WAVES program, and there you see her on the right when she was in that program, was quite celebrated and had been published. Her accounts as part of the war effort certainly got a lot of attention in her last years. Also her activities as a politician and as a public personality in the state of Montana. She was a member of the Constitutional Convention, and there you see her in the lower left of that photograph, and here with all the women who were involved in that great effort in the early 70s. Anyway, her activities as a public personality were pretty well documented and acknowledged and celebrated. She did like I said, cut a huge wake in her involvement with the League of Women Voters, her involvement in the Constitutional Convention, with conservation issues all around the state, conservation easements, open land movements. All of that stuff had been clearly documented. But what wasn't documented was her as an architect. And in fact, she had a very important history as a modernist architect, as a major player in the field, even though she wasn't licensed in the state of Montana. She wasn't a member of the American Institute of Architects, the Montana chapter. She stayed peripheral to the field, and yet she stayed active in the field. And she was almost as passionate about architecture as she was about other social causes and political causes. And so what I did recently is to put this together in an article which the Montana Magazine published, and I was very pleased to see that, just so that this chapter of her life wouldn't be forgotten, because it was a very important chapter. And the fact that her contribution is still very much alive and well, that there are these homes mostly concentrated in Missoula that really were her artistic achievements, her creative achievements, and I wanted to bring attention to those properties as well. So a very important chapter in her life. So these are some photos of Daphne on a job site. And I think as far as this lecture series goes, it's important to start with somebody like Daphne, because she had actually two challenges as an architect. First of all, she was a modernist architect. And in practicing modern architecture in Montana in the post-World War II period was not necessarily an easy or a given thing. It was, in fact, a new architectural language that you had to convince people that one could build flat roof houses in the state of Montana. And actually, she changed her mind about that anyway. And then there was the fact that she was a woman, and that oftentimes when she would show up at a job site, nobody would trust that she was indeed the architect. Many people thought she was the housewife or the friend of the housewife, or that it was indeed a man's world. And to a certain extent, it still is, both architecture and the contracting business. So she was a pioneer in many ways, and certainly as a feminist, she she sort of confronted the problems of women entering certain professions, and certainly architecture was one of them. So again, some more photos of Daphne on an early job site, and these are some snapshots of her in her studio, and still working on architecture. And she continued to draw until her death not too long ago. Draw up designs. She was always re-envisioning space and reconfiguring space, and that's a process that began very early in her life. She was born in San Francisco, and her earliest days were there. She was a military child, a military brat, as we say, and traveled. The family traveled extensively, although they were based in San Francisco. She was born Daphne Eaches was her family name. And she talked in her memoirs about how important it was to live in a city as rich as San Francisco, a visually stimulating city. But she also saw the downside of living in a city like in a crowded urban space. And as a young child, she was keenly aware of how space impacted the way people behaved, the way they felt, the way their sense of self-worth was tied up to where they lived and how they lived and the conditions in which they lived. And she wrote and spoke very eloquently about those things. So architecture in some ways for this young woman became very much a part of her psyche, and she also saw it as very much a part of changing the world. And she really believed that architecture was a tool for bettering people's lives. So these are some of the early drawings of hers from a travel to France when she was a teenager. And, but really it was World War II and her activities in the war that I think really transformed and formed her in some ways. So these are some images from the WAVES program that she was a part of. And it was after that, after her stint in the war. Actually, she started college. She went to Bennington College for a while and then dropped out to join the war effort. And she was involved with military intelligence on the West Coast, decoding secret messages from the Pacific Theater, and was highly stimulated by that work. And in some ways, this is the Rosie the Riveter generation. She really felt in some ways that there was nothing to stop women from doing the activities that men had previously done. And it was in that post-war period that she then decided that what she really wanted to do was go to architecture school and study architecture. The only problem with that is that architecture was a man's field in the United States, and it was essentially, and architectural schools and programs were essentially closed to women. And she did something very daunting in the early 50s, which was to apply to Harvard's School of Art and Design, which was the architectural program. And at that point, a very important figure, the man that you see on the right, was the director of that program, and that's Walter Gropius, the former director of the German Bauhaus, who had migrated to America in the 1930s. And she pressed to get into that program, and she said it was terrible taking the examinations and having to take remedial mathematics in order to do it, but she did it, and she was the first female to apply to that program and be accepted by that program in the post-World War II period. So that was a very, very important thing. There had been women who studied architecture there, but decades before, and then those doors slowly closed in the first half of the 20th century. And Gropius, and in fact this is the letter of admission when Gropius actually welcomed her to the program in 1951, Gropius was very happy to see a woman applicant to the program because, of course, he had come from liberal Germany, and as a founder of the Bauhaus in the 1920s, he knew what it was like to establish a program where a co-educational architectural program, a program that was open to both men and women, and he was, in fact, frankly shocked at how patriarchal American culture was when he arrived here in the 1930s. Anyway, this is the setup for Daphne Bugbee's education. This is, of course, the Bauhaus, which was designed by Walter Gropius in Germany, in Dessau in 1925. And what we have to do is imagine how radical this building was in 1925. I mean, the idea that architecture could be very simple, streamlined, that studios could have nothing but glass as the external wall, sunlight or natural light any time of the day. These were all radical ideas, and of course modern architecture was indeed radical. It was anti-historical, ahistorical, and it was making a statement for modernity, for a new way of doing things, a new way of creating new spaces that fit our age, new technologies, new materials, new designs, to make, in fact, a much cleaner and more efficient workspace or living space. So these are the ideas that Walter Gropius brought to America in the 1930s. And I'm just going to show you some pictures of the generation of German architects and teachers who were affiliated with the Bauhaus, who came to America in what I call the great German brain drain. You know, when the Nazis rose to power, these people, these modernists, were essentially pushed out. And many of them came to the United States, like Josef Albers. And these are some photos of Bauhaus students in Berlin in 1931. This is just in the 2 years before the institution was closed by the Nazis. There is another scene from the Bauhaus. This is Marlene Dietrich, the famous actress, having her bust designed. Students work side by side, men and women, to do everything, to design tapestries, carpets, to design furnishings, to design buildings. This was the most progressive art school, architecture school and design school in the world in the 1920s and in the early 30s. And as I mentioned, it was coeducational from the get-go, from the start. So this is the ethos, the idea that Walter Gropius brought to America. And in America, he found a much, much more conservative environment. And Daphne was, in fact, one of the people, the pioneers, that broke down, in some ways, that more closed system. These are some of the students at the Bauhaus, the famous stairwell, and some of the female students at the Bauhaus. And in that photo that you see there on the left, I should mention that only one of those is actually female. Take a look carefully. The Bauhaus is an interesting place. And more pictures of Berlin in the 1930s. Again, this is the backdrop, and in some ways to paint to paint the story a little bit more broadly. This is essentially the world that was brought to America in the 1930s. And of course, the people like Walter Gropius, when they came here, they were fleeing this, which was in fact a society that was closing rather than opening in the 1930s. This is right next door to the Berlin Bauhaus, actually to the Berlin Academy. And of course, that regime was completely closed to modern ideas, and so those modern ideas came along with those great architects to the United States. So more propaganda against modernism, modern architecture, modern design, and modern art. Among the greatest figures to come to the US was Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who essentially gave us the glass and steel skyscraper, the glass and steel boxes that have become so familiar to us in the second half of the 20th century in American cities. But Daphne was a member of that generation that was very stimulated and excited to be building modern, and was in that post-World War II period was excited about the potential to transform the spaces that we inhabit. And so these are scenes, actually a photograph of Harvard University, which was at that point all male, still all male, and the environment in which she trained. This is the generation of architects that trained at Harvard just immediately before she was there. I.M. Pei was in the class 2 years ahead of her. Paul Rudolph was also 2 years ahead of her. A very, very exciting generation. All of these guys trained with Walter Gropius. And there is Daphne, right along with the boys at the School of Architecture. So eventually, Harvard began admitting women, and other women followed. So here we see her in a studio. This is close to graduation, when other women had, in fact, joined the program. But she was the first. And clearly, what was happening there at Harvard was very interesting. It was obviously, it was the ideas of international modern architecture, international style architecture, which is what Walter Gropius and those Bauhaus faculty were, in fact, bringing to America. But there was also this figure, Frank Lloyd Wright, who was our homegrown modernist. And his attention to materials, certainly his embrace of nature in his architecture, the way that a building is supposed to be a dialogue with the natural world, those ideas were also very, very important to Daphne. And she spoke and wrote extensively about how Frank Lloyd Wright's ideas really were at the core of her education. So it wasn't just these European ideas, there were also American ideas about integrity of architecture, truth to materials, architecture that was functional first, aesthetic second, but in that aesthetic that you saw a connection to the natural world, you saw a connection to our own place, our own traditions, our own history in the United States. So this is also the architecture that inspired her greatly, not just the Bauhausian thing. So this is the famous falling water. So that integration to nature is going to be a crucial piece for the development of her career. This is Walter Gropius, and of course Gropius had been here before the 1940s, before World War II. He actually submitted a design for the Chicago Tribune Tower competition in 1922, and this was the most radical design of that entire competition. That was modern architecture in 22. Of course, they didn't choose to build that. They built this Gothic-y, gargoyle-covered, awful thing in Chicago. I mean, it's a great building, but it's totally retardataire, as the French say, right? I mean, looking backwards, whereas Gropius was looking forwards in architecture. Oops, and now I'm going backwards in my slides, so apologies all around. Anyway, this is his model for that skyscraper. I mean, Chicago has hundreds of buildings that look like this today, but it took almost a full century to get to that moment. He was predicting this in 1922. Clean, machine-like aesthetic, clean lines, boxiness, and of course, in a desire to be different from what we had seen before. So leaving history behind, leaving all those kind of revival styles behind, what I call sort of modern buildings wearing old prom dresses. So leaving that behind and making truly modern buildings, buildings that were structurally the newest technologies, the electricity, iron cage structures, glass curtain walls, but that not only were they structurally, from an engineering perspective, modern, but they also looked modern, and they were honest about their modernity. That's what he wanted to build in the 20s, but it took a while before Americans would embrace this. Anyway, after World War II, and actually in the late 30s, he was actually to give us some demonstrations of what modern architecture meant in a domestic context, not just in public buildings or in public skyscrapers, but in, for example, this is his own house in Massachusetts. This was built in 1938. And there are all kinds of ideas here that you can see repeated in buildings in his first public building. So this is, for example, the graduate commons at Harvard, which he built as a member of the faculty in 1950. So again, it's the Bauhaus design, flat roof buildings, sort of boxy structures, laid out as if you were putting together Lego pieces. So you start with a module, repeat that module, alter the difference, creating courtyards in between, treating the building as if it were a piece of sculpture, really. So it's a sort of latent cubist designs in these buildings. And I'm aware now that people hate this architecture today. I mean, we find it boring, we find it dull, we find it, inhuman, we find it less than interesting. And that's partly because we love historic architecture, and we love the familiar, we love the gabled roof and the columns, the classical columns. But we have to give this its due. I mean, this represented for Americans in the 1950s, for the world really, in the middle of the century, a rebirth. And it was utopian, and it was democratic, and it was functional, it was clean, and it was modern above all things. So again, these are Gropius's designs for that the graduate commons, and you can see how they really do look back to his projects in Germany and now on the American landscape. These are also from 1950. And we had seen very, very little of this architecture in Montana. I mean, we began to see it in the late 50s, but eventually it would come here as well. It came west, and Americans all around began designing buildings like this. This is one of her projects in graduate school. So this is a high-rise, a kind of utopian apartment blocks from the early 1950s, a pen and ink drawing. And then these are snapshots of her graduate thesis. And what I want to point out here is obviously it looks an awful lot like Gropius's architecture, sort of low one-story buildings on a kind of on a campus, because it really wasn't a campus, a set of school buildings. They're very, very similar to Walter Gropius's big projects, only on a smaller scale. But the important thing is to note what this was for. It was a school for delinquent girls. This was a real project. The town of Lancaster actually put this out to bid, and she jumped in there with an actual project to design a series of buildings for a campus for delinquent girls. And so what you see there is obviously modern architecture, but the other important thing is the social mission, the idea that you could create spaces that were in fact generous, that were beautiful, that were efficient, that allowed lots of room, and that were integrated with nature, because nature is our salvation. And so it made sense to locate a campus for delinquent girls in a rural setting with lots of trees, lots of open space, and these are her drawings, her designs for that project, which obviously she passed for her thesis. She didn't get the job, ironically, so this was never actually built, but it's still a good project. I have to envision that this has got to be the head mother or the head mistress, right? And that those definitely are delinquent girls. But here you see some real sort of Bauhausian ideas. There's the fireplace in the middle. Actually, that's a Frank Lloyd Wrightian idea, right? A great fireplace in the middle. The hearth is at the center of this lounge space. The curtain wall, the idea of glass windows everywhere. A lot of this was incorporating new ideas about education and educational spaces. School buildings were being designed left and right along these models as well. So she was not out of sync. She was right in the middle of modern architectural design at the time. And I love this photograph in particular because here she is defending her thesis in 1951 at the end of her period there, and she was 7 months pregnant in the photograph. So bucking all kinds of norms at the time. Anyway, not long before, actually, just before starting the project, she married Henry Bugbee, who was a philosophy professor at Harvard, and later, after completion of the thesis, she married Bugbee and started a family with him, although he already had children from a previous marriage, and then he received the job of heading the philosophy department at the University of Montana in Missoula. And so the Bugbees came west. And here's a photograph of Henry Bugbee when he was chair of the philosophy department at the University of Montana. I don't know that the world needs that many philosophers. But anyway, it was a big program. The world needs more philosophers, yes. I'm starting to sound like a modern politician, aren't I? Anyway. So that's Henry there in the circle, in the oval. And as part of and actually, Henry is an interesting figure in his own right. He's considered the father of environmental philosophy, kind of where philosophy meets environmentalism. And he was certainly a major player in the preservation movement in the state of Montana as far as open lands go. And so it wasn't just philosophy, it was applying philosophy. So good ideas being made real. And Daphne, I think, was very much a part of that movement. Missoula, as you know, was a major hub for environmental causes starting in the late 50s, and in no small part because Henry Bugbee was there and teaching that as part of his curriculum. Daphne, meanwhile, became a housewife, but a very engaged housewife. And the interesting thing is that she didn't give up her architectural career. I mean, she did not practice architecture in the conventional way, but she continued to practice architecture. And so this is some newspaper clippings and a photograph of the house that she built for them in the Rattlesnake. They bought some land in the Rattlesnake Canyon in the wilderness there, and then began to build homes. And as you'll notice from this list of the houses, there's a concentration of houses in just around the house that she built for her family. She said that these houses were mostly just poor houses for poor professors. But the reality is that they're very, very nice houses, and they were. And the most important thing about them is, yes, they might not have been huge houses, and they may not have been designed with the best materials, but they were designed with a great deal of design, a great deal of integrity, and certainly along modernist lines. And these faculty members that she worked with were very much open to modern architecture and modern design. And above all, they were interested in the way that they could live in relationship to the natural world. They could live in harmony with in the natural world. These were radical ideas in the late 50s and in the early 60s. I mean, people didn't willingly go off to live, in nature. And if they did, they'd build a cabin, right? The idea of building modern architecture in this interface zone was relatively new. And being as respectful to the natural world and incorporating as much of it into the design of the house as possible. Those were the ideas that Daphne and her husband were playing with in designing these homes. And obviously there were a class of people who were interested and mostly based at the university, but not exclusively. So this is the first house that she designed. It's their home, built in between 1959 and 1960. And as you can see, it's just an L-shaped structure. The Rattlesnake Creek flows right here. And so the house really fronts the rattlesnake, and there's a pool over here. The idea was, in fact, to open up the house to that space. Obviously, she compromised on the roof. She intended to have a flat roof, but indeed, it's a pitched roof. A gabled roof with shingled roof as well. So that's her at the entrance to her house, and actually that entrance hasn't changed at all since 1958, so it's rather nice to see that little detail there. These are some shots from the interior. In a minute, I'll show you photos of this view. Lots of glass, lots of openings. Again, the penetration and decks coming off the house, these were all radically new ideas in the 50s in Montana. The fireplace that you see here, her kids picked the pebbles, all the rocks that you see there up in Flathead Lake. So there was this idea that the materials were local, the materials were familiar, the materials were Montana materials. And there's another view of that fireplace on the right in the little corner of the house leading out to the creek. One of the boys sitting at the picnic table in the back. And there's Daphne and Henry, and the fireplace, of course, is at the core, at the center of the house. It both faces inside the house, the living room, but also the outside as well. Again, novel ideas for the time. And there she is. The kitchen in this house is particularly small, really small. I mean, it's like, about basically like as much room as you have here. You walk in and you walk out, essentially. And she changed her mind about kitchens, but she said, you know what? Who needs a big kitchen? No woman cooks these days. You just throw it in the oven and go, right? So it was a different age. I mean, it was an age in which efficiency and was important, and certainly a modern active woman wasn't going to spend a whole lot of time belaboring the cooking thing. She was going to get the TV dinners and put them in the oven, and she was going to get the hors d'oeuvres and pop them out, and so it's a very, very small kitchen. There's the living room again. I like this picture. I like the cat on the counter. Of her own, 2, and then there were 3 of Henry's kids. And then this is the house today, and you can see here's the fireplace again, and the kind of the idea of clean surfaces, not a whole lot of fuss. This is her original desk in the library, and the whole thing just completely seals up into a blank wall. So it's now open, the desk is open and the cupboards are open, but the idea was that if you were having a party, you could essentially close it all off and go. And this is a corner of the house today on the decks outside. The house has been lived in ever since the Bugbees were there. So it's had lots and lots of children have grown up in this house. And so in some ways the house has evidence of that. You know what I'm saying, right? And this is the Brown residence. This was built for a physician in Missoula. And here we really see the Bauhaus ideas. I mean, this looks very Gropius in its that kind of box that sort of projects out into space. But again, the materials are simple materials, brick and wood beams. This is the entry to the house, and this is a kind of a novel idea, this idea of cutting out, creating a garden by cutting out the roof of the house and allowing natural light. Originally, it was a Japanese-style garden. So again, the ideas of Japanese architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright, and the Bauhaus sort of come together in the Brown residence. A beautiful house. And the current owners asked if they should fill this in, and I said, no, don't do it. Because the important here is that interpenetration, the idea that you've got nature in the house and nature, and you have easy access to the out of doors. This, of course, doesn't look novel to us today, but you have to place yourself in time. It was radically novel at the time of the building of this house. And this is the entryway to the house. The house has huge closets, lots of closets. Why is that? Because earlier American housing had very little closets. So small kitchen and a lot of closets. So that gives you a sense about Daphne's, her occupations, right? And she was indeed a grande dame. She dressed to the nines, so big closets for a lot of clothing, jewelry, that sort of thing. The owner of the house, originally these doors just would pop open, the closets, so they didn't have any handles. And the owner was debating whether she should keep those handles or not. And I said, take them off. Take them off. This is apparently the first lighted bar in the city of Missoula. These folks did a lot of entertaining. The houses were really sort of for entertaining. So in the dining room, you push open those panels, and there was the bar with the cabinets. It's been painted, unfortunately. Originally, it was in that blondish wood, actually like the wood that you see in this building. This is a spec house that she designed, and actually it was picked up by a number of architects in town and builders in town. So there are countless copies of this house all over Missoula's South Hills, the neighborhood that was developing in the 60s and 70s. It's a very, very small house, but I talked with a woman who actually lived in this house, and she said everything fit perfectly. Everything had its proper place. It was like the most tightly designed house, and it's still there, and it has countless copycats in the neighborhood. A very efficient design. And actually, she said that when she designed this house, she challenged herself to design something that didn't have a flat roof. So here she was working intentionally with the whole idea of a pitched slope, a dramatically pitched slope to accommodate Montana's then heavy winters, because we haven't seen anything that warrants that kind of a slope today. One of the more dramatic houses is the Field Residence, designed in the late 60s, and here you see it. Actually, that's Daphne, and I don't know who the gentleman is in the photograph, but there you see her on the porch of the house, and here we see the house as you approach it. It's on at the end of Elk Ridge Road, and you literally drive into the garage, and then this is the garage studio part of the house, and it joins the rest of the structure, the living structure on the left, which is on 3 stories built into the side of the mountain. And she talked about how here the idea was to have literally the slopes of the roof mimic the saddle of the mountain nearby. So to pick up on that idea of the landscape that surrounds it. Some photos of the house under construction in the late 60s, 66 to 67 to 68. And there it is, as it was published. And the Field family as they were growing up in the house. And the house as it looks today. It's actually in terrific shape. And the homeowners are very proud to live in a Daphne Bugbee house. You can imagine that the interior spaces are quite amazing with that kind of access to the visuals and the outside. So this is going up the stairs, a lot of natural wood, all built-in cabinets, bookcases, all of which were designed by Daphne as part of the interior. Terrific views. This is the kitchen as you enter the kitchen from that deck. So a terrific house. And kind of in the same vein as this house, the Kimball Residence, which she designed for a good friend of hers. And this is probably, in my opinion, it's her masterpiece. It's really an amazing house, built in 1976. And that's the house today. It has lots of very interesting features. Probably the most important are these beams that come straight down into the ground, where they're supported by these concrete posts. But it's a wonderful house. And there you see the original design. The original homeowner here was Native American and actually asked her to build something that evoked the teepee. And so the idea of the beams literally going to the ground is an evocation of the teepee poles. And there's the profile drawings of the house. Originally, the poles actually went to both ends, although the only ones that actually do today are these. The house has been added to, and now this area has been filled in the back of the house. And that was done by the current owner, and it was done under Daphne's guidance. So she was literally the neighbor and was able to advise him on how to expand the house. But those pylons are pretty interesting. And she didn't invent this idea, obviously, but I think she really took it to a very dramatic solution in this house. The house, interestingly enough, has been almost entirely rebuilt. And here's the why. I mean, the current homeowners bought it when Daphne was the next door neighbor. And Daphne admitted to them that the guy kept running out of money, and so the house wasn't ever finished the way it was intended to be finished. And so the current homeowners decided that let's do it the way Daphne intended. And so they basically removed all the board and bat from the outside of the house and refinished it with the Wright siding, and she was actually there at the moment. So it's a very rare thing for an architect to experience that. I mean, usually they have to sort of suffer through the consequences of budgets, right? And they have to sort of see their houses transform before their eyes, and they see the building actually get farther and farther away from what they intended. But in this case, the house reverted to what she originally intended, which is actually quite wonderful. And this is why I think it's a very interesting model. So it's been almost entirely rebuilt, and this is what it looks like today. And the fact that Daphne was present for that rebuilding is actually a marvelous thing. It's a really beautiful house. I mean, it's a kind of an Architectural Digest-worthy house. And then the final house that she designed, although there are lots and lots of drawings, and I'll show you some of those in a minute here, for other projects, she designed a second home for herself and her second husband. And so this is a detail of that house, which she built in 1981. And I think her husband was elderly when they married, and increasingly in the last years of her life, she was concerned about designing a house that was well suited to people in their old age and the infirmities of old age. And this house is a very idiosyncratic house. Namely because it was designed around the needs of her husband and herself. So it's almost a kind of fortress-like house. It's very, very, I don't know how to, kind of a reclusive house, very private house. And it has lots and lots of elements in it that really were well suited to their particular lifestyle. For example, she wanted lots of views, but she also wanted great privacy. So for example, these balconies, there's lots of balconies, lots of porches all around the house, give you lots of views of the natural world, but they're very private. You could never tell that there are people actually sitting or enjoying the out of doors. Here's just some details of the house. This is a solarium, and there you see it today on the left. She designed the lamps for the house. When you walk into the house, there's this curious low window that runs like about, 10, 12 feet long at about a foot off the ground, and you're like, why is that there? I mean, what could that possibly, what purpose could that window possibly serve? And then when you enter the living room, and here's Wendell Jones, her second husband, playing his piano inside the living room. And there it is, the living room as it looks today. And you realize that window runs underneath the piano. And she once explained that to me, that she said that she hated dark corners in rooms. And that here she was designing a room that had all this natural light, but there was that pocket of darkness underneath the piano that she just didn't. And so she designed a long, narrow window to illuminate Wendell's feet as he was playing the piano. And there's the living room as you see it today. She worked with another classmate of hers from Harvard who was an architect in Seattle to actually design that, the tower that you see there, or that light well above the living room. But it's a very, very impressive space, almost teepee-like when you're in it. And it covers the living room, the family room, and then the living room, family room, and the kitchen space. And she agonized. She was a tall woman. Here you see her on the right. She agonized about the height of the counter, the counters in the kitchen, and the height of that wall that covers it. She changed it a couple times in the drawings, and eventually lowered it and placed the bookcases that you see there in it. And there she is in the kitchen. It's changed now because the current owners have changed all the tile and the appliances, but that happens to kitchens. And obviously she had changed her mind about the centrality of the kitchen in a woman's life, right? So this kitchen is central to the house, to the experience of the house, for sure. And there it is. And as I mentioned, these are just some of her sketches, some of them from the 70s, but she was doing this up until the moment she died. Always rethinking space, and actually there's a great project for a home for senior living, where she was putting all of her ideas for like the ideal space for someone in their retirement to live. So it was communal, and it was a lot of open spaces, but it had all the tricks that she had accumulated over the years about how one should live commodiously and comfortably. Okay. So, and this is just the long list of the people who own the homes, and were very, very generous in letting me peek around and poke around and sneak around their properties.